I was sitting in the employee break room at Nashville General, staring into a paper cup of burnt hospital coffee, when Grace's name lit up on my phone. It was just after 7:30 in the morning, and I'd been on my feet since before sunrise, reviewing reports, finalizing numbers, and preparing for a meeting that would probably take years off my life. My team thought I'd stepped away for a moment of fresh air, but the truth was I just needed 30 seconds where no one was asking me for decisions, approvals, or miracles. Grace rarely called early. Texts, sure. Late night rants about work. Absolutely. But calls, especially morning calls, were a different category. I wiped a smudge off my glasses, took a breath, and answered with the automatic smile that every mother reserves for her child. "Morning, honey. You okay?" Her voice came through fast, breathless, too light and too shaky to be normal. "Mom, hey, sorry to call so early. I wanted to tell you something before you see it online or hear it from someone else." My stomach dropped. There are only a handful of sentences a child can say that make a mother instantly imagine the worst, and that was one of them. I stood up straight, the chair scraping loudly behind me. "Grace? What happened? Are you hurt?" No, I'm fine," she said quickly, and then, after a pause that felt longer than my entire career, "I'm getting married." I blinked at the microwave across the room, its red digital numbers glowing 7:32 a.m. like they were mocking me. "You're what?" "I'm getting married," she repeated, more firmly this time, like she needed to convince herself as much as me. "His name is Andrew. We've been seeing each other for a few months. It just felt right. We're doing the civil ceremony at the courthouse tomorrow morning." I pressed my hand to my forehead. Grace had always been impulsive, but marriage? Marriage was a leap even she had never hinted at. "Grace, sweetheart. Does anyone know? Have you told anyone else? Have you thought this through?" "I have," she insisted. "And yes, I've told his family. They're really supportive. His mom already booked dinner for tonight so we can all meet before the ceremony." His family. Supportive. Dinner tonight. Of course they knew before I did. I leaned against the counter beside the sink, suddenly feeling my age in every bone. "Grace, honey, I love you more than anything in this world. You know that. But this is a lot to take in, all at once." "I know," she whispered. "And I'm sorry for springing it on you. I was scared you might talk me out of it." That one stung. More deeply than I wanted to admit. "You think I would try to stop you from being happy?" I asked softly. "I think you try to protect me," she said, "and sometimes that feels the same." Her honesty cut cleanly, but there was no malice behind it. She sounded young, overwhelmed, and trying to make a brave decision for herself. I swallowed hard. "Okay," I said. "Tell me what time dinner is." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath underwater. 6. At the Oak River Country Club. His parents are members. Of course they were. Places like that were built to make people like me feel out of place. Not the real me, but the version the world assumed I was, because I chose to live quietly despite the success I'd worked myself half to death for. "I'll be there," I told her. "Thank you, Mom," she said, the relief in her voice almost childlike. "You're going to love them." I doubted that, but I didn't say it. I just told her I loved her and ended the call. I took a moment. One long moment where I just stood there in the stale break room, listening to the buzz of fluorescent lights and trying to slow my heartbeat. Then I glanced at my reflection in the vending machine glass. My dark brown hair pulled into a sensible bun, my navy blazer, the small gold necklace Grace bought me for Mother's Day 5 years ago. I looked like a competent woman, responsible, put together. Exactly what the hospital board needed me to be. But I also looked tired. And tonight was not a dinner I could attend as the polished executive who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals. Tonight I needed to be Diana the mother. Simple, modest, unassuming. The version of myself I deliberately built for years so Grace wouldn't grow up with dollar signs in her eyes instead of values. That version had always been enough for her. But would it be enough for the people she was marrying into? The day passed in a blur of management meetings, crisis solving, and enough paperwork to drain the soul. No one at work knew that outside these hospital walls, I lived simply in a small 2-bedroom house, drove an 8-year-old Toyota, and kept my finances discreet. People made assumptions because of that. Polite assumptions, harmless ones. The kind that never bothered me. But Andrew's family didn't make harmless assumptions, as I would learn soon enough. At 5:15 p.m., I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. I chose a soft beige cardigan, a plain white blouse, and dark jeans. Not too casual, not too formal. Comfortable. Respectable. Modest. My hair stayed in its usual bun. My makeup was minimal. I looked like a woman who lived a quiet life. A woman with no reason to intimidate anyone. As I grabbed my keys, I felt it, the slightest tremor of nerves. Not because I feared strangers' opinions, but because Grace's happiness depended on tonight going smoothly. I didn't want to be the reason her evening soured. The Oak River Country Club sat on the edge of town, grand and sprawling, with manicured hedges and a fountain so dramatic it looked like it was auditioning for a movie. I pulled into the valet line behind a parade of glossy black SUVs and sleek European cars. My Toyota, bless its dented bumper, did not blend in. The valet smiled politely, but I saw it, the half-second flicker of surprise. I handed him the keys with a thank you and walked through the large glass doors. The lobby smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood. I paused only long enough to steady myself before heading toward the hostess stand. Reservation under Bennett, I told her. Andrew's last name. Her eyes flicked over my outfit. Of course, she said with a tight smile. Right this way. She led me past rows of couples clinking crystal glasses, laughing over steak dinners, wearing jewelry that cost more than my car. But none of that bothered me. I'd earned more than every person in that room combined. I just didn't need them to know it. The hostess stopped at a large table near the back. And there they were. Grace stood up first, smiling nervously. She looked beautiful, her soft curls falling around her shoulders, her blue dress making her eyes look impossibly bright. Andrew stood beside her, tall, dark-haired, grooming sharp enough to suggest he'd stepped out of an ad campaign. And then there were his parents. His mother, Patricia Bennett, wore a pearl necklace as thick as my thumb and a diamond ring that caught the chandelier light like it was designed to blind people. His father, Richard Bennett, had the posture of a man who treated everyone like a business transaction. Both looked at me the way people look at a grocery store brand in a room full of designer labels. Mom, Grace said, stepping forward to hug me. I'm so glad you're here. I kissed her cheek. Wouldn't miss it. She guided me to the table, and I felt the weight of Patricia's assessing stare before a single word left her mouth. So, Patricia said, folding her arms neatly. You must be Diana. Yes, I said warmly. It's wonderful to finally meet you. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. We've heard some about you. Some. Not much. Not enough. Not flattering, probably. Richard extended a hand. Grace says you work at a hospital. I do, I replied. What do you do there? Patricia asked, and not like she was curious. Like she was checking boxes on a form. I opened my mouth to answer. But she wasn't done. Are you a receptionist? Or perhaps administrative support? Andrew cleared his throat. Mom. No, I'm simply trying to understand, she said, lifting her chin. Grace mentioned you're very down-to-earth. Down-to-earth. A polite translation for not wealthy enough for my son. I held her stare, calm, steady. I suppose you could say that. Patricia leaned back satisfied, as if she'd confirmed what she wanted to believe. And that was the moment I knew tonight would be exactly the test I had prepared for. Not of wealth. Not of class. But of character. I settled into the chair Patricia had directed me to, smoothing my cardigan over my knees. Grace squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder that she could feel my tension even when I was calm on the outside. Andrew's fingers brushed against mine briefly, a small gesture meant to reassure me. I gave him the faintest nod of acknowledgement, careful not to overdo it. Tonight wasn't about me showing charm or wit. It was about seeing people as they really were, and letting them reveal themselves. Patricia's lips pressed into a tight line, and she tilted her head slightly, as if studying a puzzle she'd yet to solve. So, you've been in healthcare for a while? She asked, her voice courteous but dripping with skepticism. Yes, 20 years, I said lightly, letting the years roll off my tongue like a casual fact. I didn't feel the need to embellish. This wasn't a job interview. But I could sense her eyes narrowing just slightly at the number. 20 years of dedication didn't automatically scream, successful, to someone like her. And, what department? Richard interjected, leaning forward. He had that same evaluating look, the kind of thing executives wear naturally, as though every handshake was a negotiation and every conversation a performance review. I smiled politely. I'm in hospital administration. Operations, finance, strategic planning. Basically, I make sure the hospital runs efficiently and stays financially sound. The pause that followed was long enough for me to feel a subtle shift in the air. Patricia's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, like she wasn't expecting that answer. But she recovered quickly, giving me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Interesting, she said. It must be stressful. It can be, I admitted, but I love what I do. Helping people and improving systems is rewarding in ways money can't measure. She nodded, though I suspected she didn't truly understand. Money. This was the lens through which she evaluated everyone. Everything else, apparently, was secondary. Andrew glanced at me across the table, concern in his eyes. He leaned slightly forward, as if to defuse the tension, but Patricia wasn't done. And Diana? Where did Grace get her sense of independence? She's very confident for someone so young. I felt a flicker of pride. Grace had been my little shadow, learning from me without realizing it. I kept my voice steady, calm. I think she's always been that way. Confidence is something you nurture with love and encouragement, not just inheritance or wealth. Richard hummed thoughtfully, though the tone in his hum suggested judgment rather than reflection. I guess I'm surprised. Grace always talks about people achieving success through certain opportunities, connections. I leaned back slightly, keeping my posture neutral, and let my gaze drift across the table. Opportunities help, yes. But integrity, hard work, and persistence matter more than connections. I've tried to show her that. Patricia exchanged a glance with her husband. The sort of glance you give when you've just realized someone doesn't fit neatly into the mold you'd imagined. I smiled politely, sipping my water, allowing the silence to linger. This was the part one had been waiting for, the slow unveiling of true character, without my interference. Grace's eyes met mine briefly. She was nervous, biting her lower lip slightly, and I gave her the tiniest squeeze of encouragement under the table. I didn't need to say a word. She understood that I was in her corner, silently guarding her against anyone who might belittle or underestimate her mother. Dinner arrived, and the conversation shifted toward lighter topics. Vacations, favorite books, Grace's upcoming work projects, but I noticed subtle undercurrents. Every compliment to Grace was tinged with a reminder of status. Every question about my life carried an invisible comparison. They assumed I was simple, ordinary, perhaps even struggling. And I let them think that. I wanted to see how far the assumptions would go. You know, Diana, Patricia said as she reached for the breadbasket. It's really refreshing to see Grace with someone so relatable. It must be nice for her to experience a normal household every now and then. I paused, a knife hovering over my plate, and nodded. Yes, family is grounding. My tone was calm, soft, yet deliberate. I let the words hang. She smiled faintly, seemingly pleased with herself. And what do you do in your free time? I imagine reading? Gardening. The questions were intended to pigeonhole me, to fit me into the safe, non-threatening mold she had already constructed. I answered truthfully, speaking about hiking, volunteering at the local community center, occasional painting classes. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that could possibly challenge her worldview. Andrew's father, of course, couldn't leave it there. And does Diana manage her finances herself? Or does Grace's mother have help? I looked directly at him, my expression polite, neutral, and unflinching. I manage everything myself, I said. Budgeting, investments, taxes. You name it. The pause that followed was telling. The Bennetts were used to women who let accountants or spouses make decisions. A self-sufficient, competent woman? Apparently disconcerting. Grace shifted in her chair, sensing the tension, but she didn't interrupt. I admired her restraint. She had grown up seeing me handle situations like this calmly, and I think she was learning to do the same. Dinner continued with subtle tests disguised as casual conversation. Patricia asked about my favorite restaurants, hinting at places with Michelin stars. I mentioned a small, family-owned Italian spot downtown. Richard commented on my clothing. Again, the cardigan, the simple blouse, the unassuming jewelry. His eyes lingered just long enough for me to know he was calculating. And I stayed quiet. Calm. Observant. This was not the night for me to boast or prove anything. The night belonged to their judgments, and I was letting them unfold naturally. Dessert came, and Grace whispered to me, barely audible over the soft classical music in the background. "Mom, they're being weird." I gave her a small reassuring smile. "They're curious, Grace. Let's see what else tonight brings." I could tell Andrew was uncomfortable, shifting in his chair, occasionally glancing at his parents with the same unease I felt. He liked me, I could tell. He liked me more than they did, but he was cautious. Protective but uncertain. I didn't blame him. Patricia made a pointed comment about the cost of hospital healthcare, implying it must be difficult for someone like me to navigate such a complex system. I nodded, murmured agreement, and let her assumptions stand. I wasn't here to argue. The evening was about observation. Richard, emboldened by what he assumed was my meekness, leaned back and said, "I suppose Grace has always been drawn to people who are practical, grounded, like her mother." I smiled faintly, letting the compliment linger. The reality of it was entirely different, but I didn't correct him. Not yet. Tonight. Patience was my ally. Grace's hand brushed mine once more. A silent question. I nodded, reassuring her that I understood. This was the night she would learn about character, about what really mattered beyond wealth or status, and she would remember it forever. I finished my water, placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, and waited. The Bennetts had no idea that the woman sitting quietly at the table, the one they assumed was ordinary, financially modest, and socially inexperienced, was capable of operating businesses, negotiating contracts, and managing millions. They had no idea that the calm, unobtrusive mother before them was the very definition of success. I allowed their assumptions to settle, letting them feel comfortable in their own judgments. It was fascinating to watch. You could see the tiny adjustments in posture, the subtle recalculations in their expressions. Each comment they made about simplicity, modesty, or practicality was a test of their own biases, and each one passed without them realizing it. Grace leaned closer, whispering again, "Mom, are you okay?" I smiled gently, squeezing her hand. "I'm more than okay, honey. I'm exactly where I need to be." I lifted my fork, began eating dessert, and prepared myself for the part of the evening where patience would meet revelation. This was only the beginning. The conversation had settled into that delicate rhythm where everyone tried to appear polite, yet judgment hung thick in the air. Grace kept glancing at me, her fork hovering mid-air, as if afraid to say anything that might escalate the tension. I could feel the weight of the Bennett's gaze, subtle yet sharp, calculating every gesture, every word. It reminded me of boardroom negotiations I'd led, except this time, the stakes were emotional rather than financial. "You must travel a lot with your work," Patricia said, her tone attempting casual curiosity but heavy with underlying skepticism. "It must be hard to manage a career like that. And a family, of course." I smiled, keeping my expression soft. "It's a challenge at times, but one I enjoy. I've always believed that discipline and organization make anything possible." Patricia's lips pressed together. She clearly expected a flustered, overwhelmed answer. Instead, she got calm, composed, and measured, a woman who wasn't afraid of her own accomplishments, even if they were invisible to the casual observer. Grace's eyes widened slightly as if to say, "Yes, Mom, exactly." She had grown up seeing me balance impossible schedules, quiet triumphs, and unseen victories. She knew the strength behind my calm exterior. But Andrew's parents had no clue. Richard leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Discipline and organization are great," he said. "But surely there are limits. You can't possibly be as hands-on as you say with a family." I nodded, letting the comment slide like water off a duck's back. "Of course," I said gently. "No one can do everything alone. But you do what you can with the time and resources you have. You find the balance." Patricia interjected before I could continue. "And Grace. She's incredibly lucky to have a mother like you. It must be very comforting for her." I allowed a small appreciative smile, but said nothing. It was the sort of comment that sounded like a compliment but carried an undertone of condescension, the kind that assumes the person being praised is somehow less capable or worthy. I was used to it. Over the years, I'd learned that true strength didn't need to be announced. It could simply exist quietly, like a steady heartbeat beneath the surface. Grace reached for her water, fumbling slightly as her nerves betrayed her calm exterior. "Mom, maybe we should talk about something else," she whispered under the table. I leaned closer and whispered back, "We're fine, honey. Just keep being yourself. You're already doing it." Her hand brushed mine, a small anchor in the storm of polite hostility swirling around the table. Andrew gave me a fleeting glance, one that spoke volumes. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for being exactly who you are." The meal continued, and the Bennetts' attempts to gauge me grew more subtle, though no less sharp. They asked about my upbringing, carefully probing for any signs of privilege or weakness. I answered honestly, keeping my tone calm and understated. I spoke of my childhood in a modest neighborhood, the years I'd spent working part-time jobs, the scholarships that allowed me to attend college. I mentioned my first job in hospital administration and the long hours that shaped me into the professional I had become. Patricia's eyes flickered, perhaps registering a hint of surprise, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. Richard's brow knitted for a fraction of a second, then relaxed, as though he were trying to reconcile the image of this modest woman with the reality of someone who had achieved more than he might ever guess. Grace's hand found mine again, this time resting lightly on my wrist. She squeezed ever so slightly. "You've got this, Mom." I nodded, silently grateful for her faith. Conversation shifted to Andrew's career, naturally, as any parents proud of their son would do. He worked in tech, ambitious, driven, and competent. I asked thoughtful questions, listened attentively, and responded with genuine interest. They seemed slightly disarmed by my engagement. Not passive flattery, but active, intelligent conversation. Then came the moment I had been anticipating, though it arrived unexpectedly, as these things often do. Patricia, having exhausted polite curiosity, leaned forward slightly and said, "Diana, do you ever worry that your modest lifestyle might limit Grace's understanding of what she could achieve?" It was a loaded question, wrapped in politeness, but the meaning was clear. Did I keep Grace from knowing luxury, status, and wealth? Did my choices somehow hold her back? I paused, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. Then I leaned back, hands folded calmly in my lap, and met Patricia's gaze steadily. I believe character matters far more than wealth. The lessons we teach our children, the values we instill, are what prepare them for life, not the possessions they inherit. Her smile faltered slightly, though she tried to recover. Richard shifted in his chair, opening his mouth to interject, but I stopped him with a polite hand gesture. "I'm not saying experiences don't matter," I continued, "or that financial literacy isn't important. But I've seen far too many people who had everything money could buy, yet failed in integrity, empathy, or judgment. I want Grace to understand that success is measured not in dollars, but in the kind of person you choose to be." A silence fell across the table. Even Andrew seemed taken aback, not because of shock, but because the words carried weight beyond casual dinner conversation. Patricia's lips pressed together, her smile stiff. "Of course, values are important," she said, but there was a tightness in her voice, a subtle defensiveness. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. This woman is not what I expected. Richard's eyes narrowed fractionally, and I knew the question about my lifestyle had hit its mark. He leaned forward, trying to reassert control. "Well, I suppose everyone defines success differently. But you must admit, it's easier to achieve certain things with resources." I looked at him calmly, unflinching. Resources can help, certainly. But they can also create dependency, distraction, and a false sense of security. I prefer to rely on skill, determination, and perseverance. That's what I teach Grace. That's what she will carry forward. Grace's hand tightened around mine again. She was quiet, listening, absorbing the lesson without me saying a word. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly, and I could see him grappling with conflicting loyalties. Loyalty to his family, and the realization that he liked me, respected me, and maybe even feared underestimating me. Patricia gave a small, almost imperceptible laugh, like a shield. "Well, Diana, you certainly have convictions." I smiled, polite but firm. "I believe in what I say. And I believe in teaching by example." The rest of the evening unfolded with more of the same. Questions veiled as curiosity, observations hidden as casual conversation. I remained calm, engaged, and composed. I let them believe what they wanted about me. I let them test my patience, my humility, my assumed limitations. By the time coffee was served, I could see it in their eyes. They were starting to realize that I was not the woman they expected. But the realization had not yet sunk fully in. They assumed I would eventually reveal a hint of insecurity, perhaps apologize for my modesty, or allow myself to be subtly diminished by their assumptions. I did none of those things. Instead, I smiled at Grace. "Honey, enjoy tonight," I whispered softly, my voice carrying reassurance without condescension. She nodded, her eyes bright. "I understand, Mom." It was true. She understood far more than she realized. She understood that true worth was quiet, that dignity did not require announcement, and that patience and observation often reveal more than confrontation ever could. I leaned back in my chair and let the Bennets continue their subtle probing, their judgments and assumptions now fully on display. This was my moment, the prelude to the revelation that would follow. I didn't rush it. I let them linger in their misjudgments, because lessons remembered are those learned without coercion. And so the evening continued, the table a stage where patience met presumption, and quiet dignity quietly set the scene for truths yet to be revealed. I took another sip of coffee, feeling a subtle thrill beneath the calm exterior. Tonight would be remembered, and not for the dinner, or the decorations, or even the ceremony that awaited Grace and Andrew tomorrow. Tonight would be remembered because assumptions, when tested, often reveal the character of those who judge, and I was about to show them just how wrong they had been. By the time dessert plates were cleared and the soft hum of classical music filled the Oak River Country Club, the Bennets' curiosity had turned into something heavier, scrutiny. They weren't just observing me anymore. They were evaluating. Every movement, every word, every gesture was weighed and measured against their expectations of who I should be. And I let them. Grace excused herself to the restroom, giving me a brief, almost imperceptible look that spoke volumes. "Mom, be careful." I returned her glance with a reassuring nod. She needed to see me calm, composed, untouchable, even when the other adults tried to intimidate. Patricia, meanwhile, had shifted into what I could only call interrogation mode. She leaned slightly forward, placing her hands neatly on the table, and fixed me with a polite but pointed gaze. "Diana, you've always struck me as very grounded. I mean, it's admirable. But surely there are times you've wanted something more extravagant? A change, perhaps." I paused, considering my response. This was a subtle probe, a question wrapped in compliments, but intended to provoke unease. I let the silence stretch, letting my calm and composure speak before I answered. "I've never measured my satisfaction by extravagance," I said slowly, carefully. "I've always believed that fulfillment comes from purpose, accomplishment, and the relationships we nurture. Material things. They can be pleasant, but they aren't necessary for a meaningful life." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. That tiny flicker told me I had unsettled her, though she tried to mask it with a tight smile. She probably expected me to flounder, to mention some superficial desire or insecurity. I didn't. Richard, sensing the shift, tried to regain control of the conversation. "Of course, Diana, but one could argue that opportunities do define the life you live. Financial resources, social connections, experiences. They give you the ability to influence and achieve more. Don't you think?" I allowed a faint smile. Opportunities can help, certainly. But they don't replace skill, judgment, or integrity. And sometimes, they can even distract from what really matters: values, purpose, and character. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, and Patricia's eyes flickered in disbelief. I could see the wheels turning in their minds. They had assumed they knew the story of my life. They assumed I was simply a modest woman, living quietly, balancing a job with family responsibilities, perhaps content to exist without ambition beyond the ordinary. But they were slowly realizing they didn't know me at all. Grace returned from the restroom, her cheeks slightly flushed, her eyes bright. She slipped back into her seat beside me, and I offered her a small, encouraging smile. She leaned closer under the table, whispering softly, "Mom, you're handling them really well." I nodded slightly. "Thank you, honey." My attention shifted back to the Bennets. Patricia, undeterred, changed tack. "And Diana, you've mentioned volunteering. That's admirable. But I'm curious, does your professional life give you fulfillment beyond service to others?" I set my napkin down carefully, as though preparing to make a statement without saying too much. I found that fulfillment comes from making an impact, whether it's in the workplace, the community, or at home. I've spent decades building systems that help people, guiding teams, and making decisions that improve lives. It's challenging work, but it's deeply rewarding. Her smile tightened further. Clearly, my words weren't fitting the narrative she had constructed in her mind. I was too competent, too accomplished, and yet too understated. She didn't know how to process someone who was powerful and effective, yet deliberately modest in appearance and demeanor. Richard leaned back, drumming his fingers lightly on the table. I see. So, you've had quite a bit of experience then. That's impressive. I allowed a small polite nod. Yes, it's been a long journey, with lessons learned along the way. But the most important lesson I try to pass on to Grace is that character matters more than accolades or wealth. Skills and accomplishments are meaningful only when paired with integrity. Grace's hand brushed mine again under the table. I gave her a subtle squeeze, silently letting her know she was safe and supported. She needed to feel that I was in control, that I wouldn't let the Bennett's assumptions diminish her confidence or my presence. Patricia, sensing perhaps that she was losing her subtle hold over the conversation, shifted once more. I suppose. It's refreshing to see someone who isn't driven purely by social status. It must make for a simpler life. I smiled, calm and unflinching. Simpler? Perhaps. But simple doesn't mean insignificant. It means choices are intentional, and values are prioritized. That's something I've always believed. Andrew, who had been largely quiet until now, cleared his throat softly. Mom, Dad. I think Diana's perspective is valuable. It's different from what we're used to, sure, but it's important. Grace has always admired her strength and independence. Patricia's lips pressed together, and Richard's jaw tightened. I could see the internal debate playing out. How to process someone who had achieved so much, quietly and confidently, without flaunting it. They were encountering a reality that challenged their assumptions, and it made them uncomfortable. I allowed a small, amused thought to cross my mind. This is exactly the point, isn't it? Grace looked at me, her eyes wide. She whispered, barely audible, Mom, are you going to tell them? I shook my head slightly. Not yet. Timing was everything. The revelation had to be precise, deliberate, and impactful. Tonight was the observation phase. Tomorrow, the wedding. But the lesson, oh, that lesson, would be unforgettable. Dinner wound down, and the conversation became lighter, though the undercurrent of judgment persisted. They spoke about upcoming events, local cultural programs, vacations, and Andrew's work. I contributed thoughtfully, never boastful, never defensive, but always precise, always competent. I could feel their perception shifting subtly, though they didn't yet recognize it consciously. At one point, Patricia remarked, It's amazing that you manage all this on your own, Diana. Many women would rely on assistance. I smiled softly. I prefer to handle things personally. It's a way to ensure quality, responsibility, and accountability. And it's important for Grace to see that dedication, self-reliance, and integrity are worth more than any convenience money can buy. Patricia's lips pressed into a tight line. Richard's eyes narrowed, his subtle frown deepening. Andrew looked at me with quiet admiration. Grace's hand found mine again, her grip firm, reassuring, thankful. As dessert plates were cleared, the Bennetts continued their subtle tests, probing questions about my past, lightly teasing assumptions about my lifestyle, hinting at societal expectations. And through it all, I remained calm, composed, unflinching, letting the evening unfold exactly as I had anticipated. By the time the check arrived and Grace began helping me gather my purse and coat, I could sense it, the first threads of doubt in their minds. The assumptions they had relied upon were unraveling slowly, almost imperceptibly, and it was beautiful to watch. Andrew walked beside me quietly, murmuring under his breath, Mom, you're incredible. I gave him a faint, amused smile. It's not about me, Andrew. It's about teaching Grace, and sometimes, lessons are best learned quietly. Grace's eyes sparkled as she linked her arm with mine. Mom, tonight, thank you. For being you. I squeezed her hand lightly. Always, honey. Always. As we stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a thrill beneath the calm exterior. The Bennets had assumed they understood me, and in doing so, had revealed themselves. The lesson was slowly unfolding, perfectly. And this was only the beginning. The ride home from the Oak River Country Club was quiet, filled with the gentle hum of the car engine and the occasional sighs from Grace. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped together on her lap, staring out at the streetlights reflecting in the puddles from an earlier rain. Andrew had driven us, offering polite conversation, but mostly keeping a watchful eye on his mother, who had, by now, returned to her familiar habit of subtly analyzing everyone in her orbit. Grace finally spoke, breaking the silence with a whisper. "Mom, do you think they liked you?" I smiled faintly, keeping my eyes on the road. "They didn't like or dislike me, honey. They judged me." "That's very different." She frowned. "They seemed confused." I chuckled softly. "Yes, confused is good. It means they're starting to realize they can't fit me into the box they imagined. That's progress." Grace let out a soft laugh, then fell silent again, thinking. I could feel the wheels turning in her mind. How her mother could remain calm under pressure, observe people, and yet maintain dignity in the face of assumptions. I'd hoped that Grace had learned some of these lessons over the years, but tonight made it all too clear that she was grasping them with clarity. When we pulled into the driveway of our home, the air smelled faintly of wet grass and autumn leaves. The simplicity of our house, the modest lawn, and the quiet street were a stark contrast to the grandiose surroundings of the evening. Grace noticed it immediately. "It's cozy," she said softly, almost apologetically. "I'm used to, well, what they have." I put the car in park and turned to her. "Cozy is good, Grace. It's real. It's lived in. It's home. That's worth far more than any ostentation or display of wealth." She nodded, taking my hand as we stepped out of the car. "I know, Mom. But, do you think they'll ever get it?" I laughed quietly. "Some lessons take longer. Some people are more concerned with appearances than substance. That's on them, not us. What matters is that you understand." Grace leaned on me for a moment, and I felt her weight, literal and figurative, as the child who had grown into a woman carried both excitement and anxiety about her future. Andrew walked up behind us, carrying his jacket, and offered a quiet, appreciative smile. I returned it with the faintest nod. He was learning too. Later that evening, after Grace had gone to bed, I sat at the small desk in my study, the one tucked in the corner of our living room. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated the neat stacks of papers, bills, and schedules I kept, all managed meticulously. I allowed myself a moment to breathe. Tonight had been a test, a subtle one, but one that had revealed much about character, both my own and the Bennets. I reflected on their assumptions, the ways they had tried to pigeonhole me into a version of life they found acceptable. They had expected humility as weakness, simplicity as naivety, modesty as ignorance. And they were wrong on every count. Over the years, I had built a life that balanced discretion with power. My accomplishments in hospital administration were substantial. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar budgets, led teams through crises that could have crippled institutions, and established community programs that directly impacted thousands of lives. Yet none of that was visible tonight. None of it had to be. My presence, my calm, my integrity, those were enough to command respect in the right context, and to expose the flaws in the assumptions of those unprepared to see beyond appearances. I poured myself a glass of water, reflecting on the quiet strategy one had employed this evening. By appearing modest, by presenting myself in a way that invited judgment, I had allowed the Bennets to show their own biases. They had spoken freely, revealed expectations, and in doing so, revealed themselves. Observation had been the key. Patience had been the ally. Now, I only needed the right moment to guide the lesson to its conclusion. The following morning, Grace was up early, buzzing with nervous excitement for the courthouse ceremony. She moved around the kitchen with that youthful energy that made everything brighter, her hands busy preparing last-minute details. I watched her, feeling the mix of pride and tenderness that comes from witnessing your child step into a new chapter of life. Andrew joined us shortly after, polite and reserved as ever, carrying his suit jacket and offering smiles that were both nervous and earnest. We shared a quiet breakfast together, discussing logistics and timing for the ceremony. All the while, I remained aware of the tension that lingered from last night, the invisible threads of judgment that would be tested today in a different context. When it was time to leave, Grace turned to me, eyes shining. Mom, thank you for being here. Really. I don't know what I would have done without you. I smiled, brushing a stray curl from her face. You don't have to thank me, honey. I'll always be here, and tonight, you'll see a little more of what really matters in people. She nodded, catching the meaning in my words even if she didn't yet fully understand. Andrew offered a quiet, respectful nod in my direction, a gesture that acknowledged both gratitude and admiration. I returned it with the smallest of smiles, keeping my composure intact. At the courthouse, the Bennetts were already waiting. Patricia's expression was prim and careful, her posture immaculate. Richard stood beside her, a faintly impatient look etched across his face. The ceremony itself was brief and formal, just a few words, signatures, and a small gathering of witnesses, but the tension remained thick in the room. Afterward, we stepped outside for photos and congratulations. Grace was radiant, smiling effortlessly, while Andrew looked proud and slightly overwhelmed. I remained near her, poised and calm, observing the Bennetts. Patricia made a comment about the simplicity of my outfit. A soft blue blouse, a tailored skirt, practical yet elegant. She implied it was quaint, suitable for someone in my position but perhaps not remarkable. I let it slide, responding only with a polite smile. Every word I allowed to pass without correction was another opportunity for them to underestimate me. Richard, of course, had to make a remark about my shoes. Modest flats, nothing extravagant, nothing designer. Comfortable, I suppose, he said, with a tone that tried to be humorous but came across as subtly patronizing. I smiled lightly, unfazed. They're practical. I find practicality often beats extravagance. The Bennetts exchanged glances, a mixture of judgment and confusion. Their assumptions were being challenged, slowly but surely, and they didn't yet realize it. As we drove to the reception venue later that afternoon, I remained quiet, letting Grace and Andrew chatter about their plans, the ceremony, and their excitement. My thoughts drifted to the moment I had been preparing for. The subtle revelation, the unmasking of assumptions, the lesson that would resonate far longer than any ceremony or celebration. I allowed myself a small smile. Patience had been key. Observation had been essential. And soon, everything would fall into place, exactly as it needed to. Tonight, at the reception, the Bennetts would see more than my modest appearance. They would see a woman of accomplishment, intellect, and integrity. Qualities they had assumed were absent. They would realize that assumptions, when left unchecked, often say more about the judge than the judged. Grace leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, murmuring softly, "Mom, I'm glad you're here. Really." I kissed the top of her hair gently. "Always, honey. Always." And with that, I prepared myself for the next chapter. The part where quiet dignity would meet revelation, and lessons would be learned in a way that no one could ignore. The reception hall was a vast, airy space, adorned with crystal chandeliers that scattered light across the polished wooden floor. It smelled faintly of roses and fresh linens, and soft instrumental music floated through the air, providing a background hum that was polite, refined, and almost soothing. Yet beneath all of that elegance, I could feel the tension, the subtle unspoken judgments, the measuring glances. The Bennetts were already at the main table, impeccably arranged, sitting as though the entire world revolved around their assessment. Patricia's posture was perfect, her smile polite, but her eyes were sharp. Richard had that same subtle frown, like a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit together. Grace took my hand as we entered. "Mom, thank you for being here. I know this could be awkward," she whispered. I smiled, squeezing her hand lightly. "Nothing awkward, honey. Just another stage in life's lessons. Watch and learn." Andrew walked beside us, holding the door for me. His small, encouraging nod reminded me that not everyone needed the same lesson, but they would witness it nonetheless. We approached the table, and the Bennetts' eyes immediately flicked to my outfit, a soft, tailored blouse with understated jewelry and modest flats. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth. Just elegance and composure. Patricia's lips pressed into a faint line, her eyes scanning me as though trying to find a flaw. Richard's frown deepened subtly, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the details. "I see you've chosen something simple," Patricia said, her voice polite but laced with an edge that implied condescension. I tilted my head slightly, a soft smile on my lips. Simplicity allows one to focus on what truly matters. Tonight is about Grace and Andrew, not me. Her smile faltered slightly. She clearly wasn't expecting a response that was both composed and assertive. Richard's eyes darted to hers briefly, perhaps searching for guidance, but I remained unflinching. As we were seated, small talk began. Conversations about the weather, the venue, and minor wedding details flowed around us, but underneath it, I could feel the Bennets' constant assessment. Every word they spoke, every glance they exchanged, was an evaluation, a subtle attempt to measure me against the life they assumed I led. Grace whispered under the table, "Mom, are you okay?" I nodded, keeping my smile soft and steady. "I'm perfectly fine, honey. Focus on your happiness tonight. That's all that matters." Andrew reached over, brushing his fingers lightly against mine. "You're amazing," he whispered quietly, "just for me." I smiled faintly, acknowledging his observation without giving too much away. As dinner progressed, I answered questions carefully, never boasting, never revealing too much. Patricia asked about my hobbies, framing her question with a polite assumption that I would mention quaint, low-cost activities. I spoke of my morning walks in the park, occasional painting classes, and volunteering at the local community center. Each word was chosen to appear unassuming, yet deliberate in its truth. Richard asked about my professional background, probing for signs of weakness or inexperience. I mentioned hospital administration and operations, speaking in calm, precise terms. I observed their reactions carefully. Their faces were masks of polite interest, but I could see the subtle calculations beneath. They were realizing that I was competent, intelligent, and fully capable, but they couldn't yet reconcile that with the modest exterior I presented. Grace's hand brushed mine under the table again, her eyes meeting mine briefly. "Mom, this is amazing." I squeezed her hand ever so slightly. She understood the lesson unfolding. Appearances could deceive, assumptions could mislead, and dignity could command respect without arrogance. The Bennets continued their subtle probes. Patricia asked about my travels, Richard about my education. I responded with calm honesty, never revealing the full scope of my accomplishments. I mentioned a few conferences and workshops, carefully selected projects, and leadership roles that sounded credible but didn't alarm them. Yet I could sense the hesitation creeping into their expressions, the first whispers of doubt about what they had assumed about me. At one point, Patricia leaned in slightly, her voice softening. "Diana, you seem very composed. I can't imagine handling so much responsibility without," she trailed off, searching for the right word. "Without stress," I offered gently. Yes, that," she said, her lips pressing into a thin line. I smiled politely. "I manage what I can, and I accept what I cannot. Discipline and preparation help, but ultimately, perspective matters most." Richard's eyebrows knitted slightly. He clearly did not expect such a measured response. Their assumptions were being challenged, slowly but undeniably. They had tried to fit me into a narrow definition of success and influence, and they were beginning to see that I existed outside it. Grace leaned closer under the table, whispering again, "Mom, do you think they'll get it?" I shook my head slightly, smiling softly. "Not yet. Timing was essential. The lesson would only resonate when I chose to reveal the truth fully. For now, patience and observation were key." As the evening wore on, the conversations drifted to topics of shared interest: books, art, and charitable work. I participated thoughtfully, engaging with intelligence and warmth, but never allowing the Bennets to see the full measure of my achievements. The subtle hints were there, if one knew how to read them. Familiarity with complex projects, comfort discussing strategic initiatives, and ease in analyzing systems and outcomes. They noticed, of course, but their pride and assumptions kept them from fully acknowledging it. Grace's hand found mine once more, and I could feel her excitement and anticipation. She had watched me handle the Bennets' judgments with calm precision, and she understood the lesson she was learning more clearly than ever. Character mattered more than wealth. Integrity outweighed appearances. Patience could be as powerful as revelation. Andrew glanced at me across the table, a look of admiration in his eyes. "Mom, you're incredible," he murmured quietly. I smiled faintly, acknowledging him without drawing attention. The moment wasn't about me. It was about teaching, guiding, and observing. The Bennets' assumptions were slowly unraveling, and soon, they would be confronted with a reality they had never expected. Dessert was served, and I remained calm, sipping my coffee and observing. Patricia made a comment about the dessert being very homey, implying simplicity and modesty in my taste. I let it pass with a polite smile. Richard tried a subtle joke about my apparent lack of indulgence, and I responded lightly, never defensive, always composed. By the end of the evening, I could see it. The Bennets were unsettled. They had assumed too much, underestimated me entirely, and their judgments were beginning to crumble under the weight of quiet competence and unassuming presence. As we prepared to leave, Grace turned to me, her eyes bright. "Mom, tonight, thank you for showing them, without even saying a word." I squeezed her hand gently. "Patience and observation, honey. Lessons are learned in many ways. Tonight was just the beginning." Andrew walked beside us, offering quiet encouragement, while the Bennets exchanged small, uncertain glances behind him. They were beginning to grasp that the woman they had quietly dismissed was far more capable, accomplished, and intelligent than they had allowed themselves to consider. And I smiled softly to myself, knowing that the culmination of this evening, the revelation of the full measure of my accomplishments, was yet to come. This was the stage, the prelude. Soon, assumptions would be shattered, judgments exposed, and a lesson about character, integrity, and dignity would resonate far beyond the walls of the reception hall. I adjusted my coat, took a deep breath, and prepared myself for the next phase. The moment when quiet strength would meet the shock of truth, and when the Bennets would finally see the reality they had overlooked. Tonight, they had glimpsed only fragments. Tomorrow, they would witness the full picture. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the living room windows, painting the walls in soft gold. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the quiet before the day's events fully unfolded. Today was the real test. The subtle revelations, the exposure of assumptions, the quiet, undeniable proof of competence and worth. Grace bounded into the kitchen, her excitement barely contained. "Mom, are you ready? Everyone's already waiting downstairs." Her cheeks were flushed, her energy palpable. I set my mug down carefully, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready, honey. Let's make this day meaningful." She paused, catching my eye. "Meaningful? Meaning what you've been teaching me?" I smiled faintly, brushing back a loose strand of hair. "Exactly. Remember, character, integrity, and patience matter far more than appearances or wealth. Today is an example of that lesson in motion." Andrew appeared in the doorway, tie slightly crooked, his expression a mix of excitement and nerves. "Mom, they're all gathered downstairs. Are you sure you want to do this today?" I nodded gently. "I am. Timing is everything. Let's just observe, respond thoughtfully, and reveal what's necessary when the moment comes." Grace linked her arm with mine as we descended the stairs. The Bennets were already in the living room, seated elegantly on the sofas, an aura of polite judgment radiating from their posture. Patricia's smile was precise, formal, but her eyes were wary. Richard's frown was just as controlled, but the subtle tension around his jaw told me he was processing more than he wanted to admit. "Diana," Patricia said, standing as we entered. "So glad you could join us again. This morning, we just thought we'd have a small casual chat before heading to the venue." I returned her smile, calm and measured. "Of course. I'd love to." We all sat, the Bennet's subtle scrutiny as thick as ever. But this time, I allowed the faintest trace of confidence to seep through my posture. Not arrogance, not pride, but a quiet, understated acknowledgement of experience and accomplishment. Patricia spoke first, trying again to frame her questions around assumptions. "Diana, you've been so modest about your work. I'm curious, how do you manage such responsibility with such simplicity?" I allowed a faint smile, leaning back slightly. I've always believed that success doesn't need to be broadcasted. It's measured in results, impact, and integrity, not in appearances or accolades. I find that the quieter you operate, the more meaningful your accomplishments can be. Her eyes flickered, just the tiniest hint of surprise, perhaps even discomfort. She hadn't expected such a direct yet controlled answer. Richard leaned forward slightly, trying to gauge my sincerity, but I met his gaze steadily. Grace whispered under the table, "Mom, you're incredible." I squeezed her hand subtly, acknowledging her admiration without breaking the calm demeanor I had cultivated. "It's not about me, honey. It's about showing how character and dedication manifest in real life. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. She attempted to recover with a soft laugh. Of course. Well, we all have our own definitions of accomplishment, don't we? I nodded lightly. Yes. And sometimes, assumptions can cloud our perception of what truly matters. That's why observation and patience are so important. The Bennets exchanged glances. I could see the subtle calculations in their eyes. The recognition that perhaps they hadn't considered the full scope of who I was. That quiet confidence, unassuming yet precise, was unsettling to them. Andrew spoke softly, trying to lighten the atmosphere. Mom has always been amazing. Grace, you've seen it. We all have. Patricia tilted her head. Curiosity mingled with skepticism. I suppose. But surely you have some indulgences, Diana? Some pleasures that go beyond work and family. I allowed a faint, knowing smile. Of course. I enjoy experiences that are enriching, that broaden my perspective. Travel, culture, learning opportunities. These are pleasures that sustain the mind and spirit. Material excesses rarely bring true satisfaction. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected a timid answer, or perhaps an admission of modest indulgence. Instead, he got measured poise, a clarity of purpose that challenged everything he had assumed about me. Grace's hand brushed mine again, her eyes wide. She understood fully what I was doing, allowing their assumptions to meet the reality of my quiet competence. The conversation shifted naturally to Grace and Andrew's future plans. I asked thoughtful questions, listened attentively, and engaged with genuine curiosity. My tone remained calm, measured, unassuming. But with each word, I could feel the Bennett subtle reassessment. At one point, Patricia leaned forward slightly, her voice softening. Diana, you've clearly achieved a great deal, even if you don't speak about it. But what motivates you? What keeps you striving? I met her gaze directly, calm and unwavering. I'm motivated by impact, by the ability to improve lives and systems, by teaching values that last beyond a paycheck or title. True fulfillment comes from knowing that your actions have meaning, that your work resonates beyond yourself. Her lips pressed together, and Richard shifted in his chair. I could sense them both trying to reconcile their prior assumptions with the reality in front of them. They had expected modesty, perhaps a hint of insecurity, and instead, they encountered clarity, intelligence, and composure. Grace whispered softly, Mom, they're noticing. I nodded slightly, letting a faint smile touch my lips. Yes, they are. The rest of the morning passed in much the same way. Subtle hints of my achievements, my intelligence, and my strategic thinking surfaced naturally in conversation. I spoke of projects I had overseen, initiatives that had improved patient outcomes, and programs I had implemented that impacted entire communities. Nothing was boastful, nothing exaggerated, but carefully framed to reveal competence and accomplishment without arrogance. The Bennets listened, occasionally interjecting polite questions, but it was clear that their assumptions were fraying. Each response I gave subtly chipped away at the narrative they had constructed, that I was ordinary, modest to a fault, and entirely unremarkable. By the time we prepared to leave for the reception hall, I could see it in their eyes, the first real glimmers of awareness. They were beginning to understand that I was not the woman they had quietly dismissed, that the quiet exterior masked years of accomplishment, intelligence, and resilience. Grace's hand found mine once more as we stepped into the car. Mom, tonight. It will be perfect, she whispered, eyes shining. I smiled softly. It will, honey. All in good time. Patience and observation have brought us here. Now the next phase begins. Andrew glanced at me quietly. Mom. They have no idea. I allowed the faintest smile. Not yet. But soon. They'll see everything they assumed was missing. And with that, we drove toward the venue, the sunlight glinting off the city streets, the air filled with anticipation. The stage was set. The Bennets' assumptions were about to meet the undeniable reality. Tonight, the lesson would be complete. The reception hall gleamed under the soft chandeliers, the polished floor reflecting a warm glow that complemented the atmosphere of quiet elegance. Guests mingled, exchanging polite greetings and congratulations, but my focus remained on one family in particular. Patricia and Richard Bennett, seated near the center, had been trying all morning to assess me, measure me, and place me neatly into the box they assumed I belonged. Grace took my hand as we entered, her eyes shining with excitement and nerves. Mom, thank you for being here. It means everything. I squeezed her hand gently. Honey, it's not about me. It's about showing the right example, teaching lessons that last far longer than a single event. Andrew fell into step beside us, offering a subtle nod of support. The Bennetts' eyes flicked toward me immediately, scanning, judging, and perhaps beginning to sense that tonight, they would see more than they had anticipated. We approached the reception table, and I allowed a calm, confident smile to settle across my face. My outfit remained modest but elegant. A tailored dress, understated jewelry, and simple heels. Nothing flashy. Nothing ostentatious. But it was enough to subtly command attention, to quietly signal that I carried myself with both poise and assurance. Patricia's polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Diana, you look lovely as always. Simple, yet refined. I returned her smile evenly. Thank you, Patricia. Tonight, I wanted to be comfortable, so I could focus on what matters most, Grace and Andrew. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, as if trying to assess whether my calm demeanor could hide any vulnerability. I allowed the faintest trace of amusement to brush across my lips. Vulnerability was not the concern tonight. It was revelation. Dinner began, and I let the conversation flow naturally, weaving in subtle hints about my professional achievements and accomplishments. I spoke of recent projects, carefully selecting the language to be factual yet understated. I mentioned leading teams, managing complex operations, and navigating high-stakes decisions. All without ever boasting, all without giving the full picture. Patricia tilted her head, curiosity creeping into her polite expression. You seem so composed, Diana. I can't imagine managing so much responsibility without some sort of support. I smiled softly. Discipline, careful planning, and understanding priorities make a great difference. And support comes from many sources. Not just financial. Mentorship, collaboration, and experience are often more powerful than any material resource. Richard's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't used to hearing such measured competence from someone he had assumed was, at most, a modest professional. He was beginning to feel the first ripple of uncertainty about the narrative he had constructed. Grace's hand brushed mine under the table, her eyes bright. Mom, they're noticing. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her observation without disrupting the composed demeanor I maintained. She understood fully, the subtle strategy of revealing competence without arrogance, of letting judgment meet undeniable reality, was already unfolding. Patricia, undeterred, tried to probe further. And Diana, your professional background, what exactly does it entail? I allowed a calm pause, letting the silence do some of the work for me. Then I spoke clearly, choosing my words with precision. I've spent decades in hospital administration and operations, overseeing multi-million-dollar budgets, implementing programs that directly impact thousands of lives, and leading teams through complex challenges. Every decision has consequences, and every responsibility has a ripple effect. It's demanding work, but deeply rewarding. Her polite smile faltered, ever so slightly. Richard's jaw tightened, and I could see the flicker of disbelief in their eyes. They had assumed I was modest, ordinary, and perhaps even limited in influence. Yet here I was, describing leadership and achievement that far exceeded their expectations. Grace leaned slightly toward me under the table, whispering softly, Mom, they're stunned. I gave her a subtle nod. Yes. Honey. And that's exactly what we need them to feel. The rest of the evening continued in much the same rhythm. I allowed small, deliberate hints of my wealth and influence to surface naturally. I mentioned charitable projects I had spearheaded, quietly noting the scale of impact, the communities affected, and the recognition I had received, without ever overtly bragging. Patricia's polite nods grew tighter, and Richard's frown deepened. They were starting to see that my modest appearance had concealed far more than they could have imagined. I could almost see the gears turning in their minds, the attempts to reconcile the woman they assumed they knew with the undeniable competence before them. Grace's hand found mine again, a quiet anchor beneath the table. Mom, you're amazing. I've never seen them like this before. I smiled faintly, squeezing her hand gently. Patience. Honey. The moment is coming. All in good time. Andrew gave me a brief glance, his admiration evident. Mom, they have no idea how much they've underestimated you. I allowed the faintest smile, calm and measured. Not yet. But soon, they will. As the reception wound down, I observed the subtle shifts in their behavior. Patricia had begun to ask questions that were more careful, more considered. Richard was quieter, less domineering. The assumptions that had guided their interactions were dissolving, leaving a tentative curiosity in their place. And then came the perfect opportunity. A small moment that allowed me to reveal just enough to tip the scales. The caterer accidentally knocked over a tray of drinks, spilling sparkling water across the table. I rose gracefully, moving to help. As I did, a glimpse of a small elegant watch peeking from my sleeve caught Patricia's eye. Not a flashy timepiece, but one of refined taste and significant value, unmistakably belonging to someone accustomed to both quality and discretion. Patricia's eyes widened imperceptibly. Richard's frown deepened, subtle surprise flickering across his face. I allowed the smallest polite smile. It's practical for keeping track of appointments and responsibilities, I said lightly, brushing the spill with a napkin. A simple gesture, a tiny detail, yet it carried meaning far beyond what either of them had expected. The Bennets were beginning to see that the woman they had dismissed as ordinary was far from it. The quiet competence, the understated elegance, the subtle proof of wealth and experience. All of it was coming into focus. Grace's eyes sparkled. Mom, they're starting to get it, she whispered under her breath. I nodded slightly, allowing a faint smile. Yes. Honey. Slowly but surely. Dinner concluded, and as guests began to drift away, the Bennets were left with a mix of admiration, disbelief, and unease. They had underestimated me completely, and the subtle hints of wealth, accomplishment, and dignity had begun to dismantle the narrative they had built around me. Andrew offered a quiet nod of appreciation. Mom, you've done it, he murmured. I smiled faintly, calm and composed. This is only the beginning, Andrew. The lesson will be complete soon. Grace took my hand once more, eyes bright with understanding. Mom, tonight, thank you. I've learned so much already. I kissed the top of her head softly. Honey, patience, observation, and integrity will always teach more than words alone. And tonight, we've started that lesson in a way they won't soon forget. As we prepared to leave, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a strategy unfolding perfectly. The Bennets had begun to realize that appearances could deceive, assumptions could mislead, and quiet competence could command respect in ways they had never anticipated. And I smiled softly, knowing the culmination, the full revelation, the undeniable lesson about character and integrity, was still to come. After the reception, we all returned home, the night air crisp and quiet. The city lights reflected in the windows of our modest house, casting a soft glow across the familiar furniture. The living room carefully arranged but warm, lived in. Grace was still chattering about the evening, about the subtle hints she had noticed, the small but telling signs that had begun to unravel the Bennets' assumptions. I followed her into the kitchen, setting my purse down and pouring myself a cup of tea. She leaned against the counter, her eyes wide with curiosity and admiration. Mom, they have no idea. All those little things tonight. They were noticing, but they had no clue. You've been incredible. I smiled faintly, keeping my tone calm, measured. Honey, it's not about being incredible. It's about patience, observation, and teaching lessons without confrontation. They've underestimated me, and now they're starting to see the truth. But it has to be gradual. Timing is everything. Grace's face lit up. Mom, tonight was perfect. You made them realize so much. And without ever saying a word outright. I can't believe how calm you were the whole time. I leaned against the counter, sipping my tea, letting her words sink in. Calmness is a choice, honey. People often confuse quiet confidence with simplicity, modesty with ignorance. But tonight, I let them reveal themselves through their own assumptions. Andrew appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie and giving me a small respectful nod. Mom, you've done more than I expected. They can't even begin to comprehend how much they misjudged you. I smiled faintly. They will understand soon enough. The revelation doesn't need to be loud or forceful. It's about timing, precision, and undeniable proof. Grace's eyes brightened. Mom, is tonight the night you're going to show them? All of it. I took a slow breath, setting my cup down deliberately. Not tonight. Tonight was observation, subtlety, planting seeds. Tomorrow, they'll see the full measure. And when they do, it will be unforgettable. The next morning arrived bright and clear. Sunlight poured into our home, filling every corner with warmth. I dressed carefully, modestly yet elegantly, ensuring every detail of my appearance reflected poise and dignity without revealing too much too soon. Grace followed suit, radiant in her dress, excitement practically spilling from her every gesture. We drove to the office I had reserved for a small family meeting. A neutral space, professional yet unassuming. The Bennetts were already there, seated with the same posture of polite judgment, anticipation subtly etched into their expressions. Patricia smiled formally, Richard remained composed but alert, and Andrew and Grace sat quietly beside me, both eager and anxious. Diana, Patricia began, thank you for arranging this. We thought it might be helpful to talk more casually, away from the reception. I nodded politely. Of course. I wanted to have an honest conversation, one where clarity and understanding could guide our discussion. Richard leaned forward slightly, arms crossed. I appreciate that. We just want to ensure we understand each other properly. I allowed a calm smile. Then let's proceed. I began with small details, continuing the approach I had used the night before. Subtle hints, measured observations, careful words. I spoke of projects I had led, initiatives I had overseen, communities I had impacted. I spoke of leadership, accountability, and responsibility. Each word was precise, deliberate, factual, and undeniable. Patricia's polite smile faltered slightly with each revelation. Richard's jaw tightened, his brows knitting. Their assumptions were slowly crumbling, the narrative they had created around my supposed simplicity unraveling under the weight of reality. Grace leaned slightly toward me, whispering, Mom, they're starting to see it. Really see it. I nodded faintly. Yes. Honey. Just a little more. I paused, allowing the silence to settle, letting the weight of my words resonate. Then I carefully revealed more, concrete proof of accomplishments, subtly yet indisputably demonstrating my financial independence and professional influence. I spoke of budgets in the tens of millions, strategic decisions that affected thousands of lives, and initiatives that earned recognition at state and national levels. Patricia's lips pressed into a tight line. Richard's frown deepened, his expression a mix of disbelief and tentative respect. They were beginning to grasp the reality they had assumed impossible, that the woman they had dismissed as ordinary, simple, and unassuming was not only accomplished but extraordinary in her achievements. Grace's hand brushed mine under the table, her eyes wide with admiration. Mom, you're amazing, she whispered. I smiled faintly, calm and composed. It's not about me, honey. It's about the lesson. Character and integrity outweigh appearances and assumptions. And now, they see it. Patricia's voice was softer, almost hesitant. Diana, we had no idea. We assumed so much. Incorrectly. Richard nodded, finally breaking his formal composure. Yes. We misjudged entirely. It's clear now that we underestimated you, and perhaps ourselves in the process. I allowed a faint smile, keeping my demeanor calm yet firm. It's easy to make assumptions, Richard, but it's far more important to observe, listen, and understand before forming judgments. That's the lesson not just for you, but for Grace as well. Grace looked at me, eyes glistening. Mom, you've shown them everything. And they finally understand. I reached out, brushing her hand gently. Yes, honey. And now the lesson is complete. Dignity, patience, and integrity always reveal the truth, eventually. Patricia's eyes softened, her expression a mixture of remorse and newfound respect. Diana, I realize now that we judged unfairly, based on appearances and assumptions. And I apologize for that. Richard nodded in agreement. We did not recognize the depth of your achievements, your intelligence, or your character. It was wrong of us, and I hope you can forgive our presumptions. I allowed a small polite smile. I forgive. The important thing is that lessons are learned, and respect is given where it is due. That's what truly matters. Grace's eyes met mine, and I could see the understanding shining there. How patience, calm observation, and quiet dignity could teach far more than words or confrontation ever could. Andrew leaned closer, whispering softly, "Mom, you've done it perfectly." "They finally see." I nodded faintly. "Yes, they do." The Bennetts' expressions had shifted entirely. The subtle arrogance, judgment, and assumptions had given way to respect, acknowledgement, and a touch of awe. They had been shown, in the gentlest yet most undeniable way, that character, integrity, and quiet strength outweighed every superficial measure of worth. Grace squeezed my hand, a quiet thank you, and I returned her gesture with the smallest of smiles. "The lesson is complete, honey. But the memory will last far longer than tonight." And with that, the room settled into a quiet harmony. Misjudgments had been corrected, assumptions had been dismantled, and dignity had quietly commanded its place in a world that often forgot its value. The day after the reception felt different. The air in our home was lighter, softer, as though a quiet tension had lifted, replaced by understanding and calm. Grace moved about the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming softly, a mixture of relief and happiness in her eyes. Andrew sat at the table, scrolling through his phone but clearly distracted, watching us with a newfound admiration. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle in my hands. The events of the past 2 days had unfolded exactly as I had intended. Observation, patience, and careful revelation had worked in harmony, dismantling assumptions, and demonstrating a simple but powerful truth. Character and integrity were what defined a person, not appearances, status, or wealth. Grace turned to me suddenly, her expression earnest. "Mom, I just want to say thank you. Not just for last night, or for showing them, but for always teaching me what really matters. I think I finally understand it fully now." I smiled faintly, brushing back a loose curl from her face. "Honey, it's something you'll continue to understand throughout your life. Lessons about character aren't learned in a single moment. They're experienced, observed, and internalized over time. But yes, tonight, and the past 2 days, were important examples." Andrew leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. "Diana, you didn't just teach Grace a lesson. You taught them, Patricia and Richard, a lesson about assumptions, about judging people based on appearances. I've never seen anything like it. Calm, quiet, and completely undeniable." I let a small, gentle smile touch my lips. Sometimes, the most profound lessons are those that are observed rather than preached. People notice behavior, composure, and integrity in ways that words alone cannot convey. And yes, even those who believed they knew me were reminded to look deeper. Grace reached across the table, taking my hand in both of hers. "Mom, all these years, you've lived modestly, quietly, even though I know you've accomplished so much. You've never shown off, never flaunted wealth or influence, and yet, everything you've done has mattered more than anyone could see." I held her gaze, my smile steady. "Exactly, honey. It's never been about appearances, or even about recognition. It's been about living a life of meaning, impact, and integrity. The way we live our values quietly, consistently, leaves the most lasting impression." Andrew nodded in agreement. "I see it too, Diana. Not just in how you handle the Bennetts, but in how you live, how you care, and how you think. That's more impressive than any title or salary." I let a soft chuckle escape me, the warmth of their acknowledgement filling the room. "Thank you. But remember, the lesson isn't about me. It's about understanding that assumptions can mislead, that appearances can deceive, and that patience, observation, and dignity are far more powerful than confrontation." Grace's eyes glistened with understanding. "I get it, Mom. I really do. And I want to live like that too. Not for show, not for anyone else, but because it's right. Because character matters." I reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, honey. That's exactly it. You carry these values forward, and you'll see how profoundly they impact your life, and the lives of those around you." Andrew shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful. "And the Bennetts. I think they finally understand too. I've never seen them humbled like that, or made to reflect on their own behavior in such a clear way. It's impressive." I nodded, taking a deep breath. It's all part of the lesson. It's not about embarrassment or confrontation. It's about insight, realization, and respect. And respect, once earned through truth and dignity, is far more lasting than any superficial approval. The morning passed in a gentle rhythm. Grace moved about the kitchen, preparing small snacks and arranging things for later, while Andrew and I shared quiet conversation about plans, responsibilities, and future decisions. There was a sense of ease in the air, a soft confidence that comes from knowing that integrity and patience have triumphed over superficial judgment. Later, as Grace and Andrew left to run a few errands, I remained in the kitchen, reflecting quietly. The past days had been a perfect illustration of lessons I had hoped to impart, not just to my child, but to those who had assumed too much, judged too quickly, and valued appearances over substance. I poured myself another cup of tea, settling into the familiar comfort of the house. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the shelves of books, family photos, and small objects that held quiet meaning. I allowed myself a brief smile, thinking of how subtly yet profoundly the Bennets had been reminded that character defines a person, not money, status, or external appearances. Patricia and Richard had left shortly after our discussion, their expressions thoughtful, subdued, yet respectful. I sensed that the lessons from the past 2 days would resonate with them far longer than any polite conversation or formal greeting could have accomplished. Grace returned home a few hours later, her energy still bright, but tempered with reflection. She hugged me tightly. "Mom, thank you. For showing me, for teaching me, for everything." I held her close, feeling the weight of years of guidance distilled into this quiet moment. "Honey, the most important lessons aren't spoken, they're lived. Remember what you've seen, what you've felt, and how dignity and integrity command more respect than wealth or appearances ever could." She pulled back slightly, her eyes shining. "I will, Mom. I promise. And I hope one day I can do for others what you've done for me. Quietly, patiently, and with integrity." I smiled softly, a gentle warmth in my chest. "You already are, honey. Every choice you make, every action, and every word carries the potential to teach, inspire, and guide. And that's far more valuable than any title, salary, or external recognition." Andrew returned soon after, carrying a small package for Grace. He handed it to her with a quiet smile. "Just a little something to celebrate today. And to remind us of what really matters." Grace opened it carefully, revealing a delicate charm bracelet with tiny symbols representing family, integrity, and meaningful achievements. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me with a gratitude that went far beyond words. "Mom, everything. I'll always remember today. And I'll always remember what you've taught me." I reached out, brushing her hair gently. "And I'll always be here, honey. Guiding, observing, and helping you see the value of character over appearances. That's what matters most." The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I watched Grace and Andrew move about with a calm confidence, the lessons of the past days settling into place. The Bennet's subtle transformation, awareness, respect, humility, was now complete. They had seen, without theatrics or confrontation, that the assumptions they had made were wrong, and that true value resides in integrity and character. As evening approached, I finally allowed myself a deep breath, leaning back in my chair and savoring the quiet satisfaction of a lesson fully taught. The tension that had lingered for days had dissolved, replaced by understanding, reflection, and a quiet respect that needed no words to be understood. Grace sat beside me, taking my hand gently. "Mom, one day, I hope I can be even half as wise and composed as you are." I let a faint smile rest on my lips, squeezing her hand. "Honey, you already are. Wisdom comes from observing, reflecting, and learning. Not just from experience, but from seeing the lessons in others. And today, you've seen one of the most important lessons of all. That character, patience, and integrity define a person far more than wealth, status, or appearances ever could." Andrew nodded silently beside her, his eyes reflecting both admiration and understanding. The quiet, composed dignity I had modeled over years, and revealed subtly over the past days, had left a lasting impression on everyone present. I poured myself one final cup of tea, letting the warmth settle, and allowed myself to smile softly, thinking of the journey we had undertaken together. The lessons had been imparted, the assumptions dismantled, and the understanding firmly rooted. Grace rested her head lightly against my shoulder. "Mom, I'll always remember this. Always." I kissed the top of her head, holding the moment gently. "And I'll always be here, honey. Guiding, observing, and reminding you of what truly matters. And in that quiet, soft glow of the late evening, I knew that the lesson had been taught, the truth revealed, and the most enduring values, character, integrity, and patience, had left their mark on everyone who needed to see them. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.